The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors that Margaret had just finished polishing. She moved quietly through the massive apartment, her cleaning supplies tucked neatly in a small cart that she wheeled from room to room. After 3 years of working for Mr. Jonathan Sterling, she had learned to be invisible when he was home. Margaret was 42 years old, with gentle eyes and hands that showed the evidence of hard work. She had moved to New York from a small town in Georgia, carrying nothing but hope and determination to give her 15-year-old daughter Zara a better life. The job at Mr. Sterling's penthouse paid well enough to cover their small apartment in Queens and Zara's school expenses, though Margaret often worked 12-hour days to make ends meet. Mr. Sterling was one of those tech billionaires you read about in magazines. His company had created some app that everyone used, though Margaret never quite understood what it did. What she did understand was that he lived alone in a space big enough for 20 people, surrounded by expensive things that he rarely seemed to notice. The penthouse had 7 bedrooms, 4 living areas, and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a fancy restaurant. On this particular Tuesday evening, Margaret was preparing for one of Mr. Sterling's dinner parties. These events happened about once a month, and they always made her nervous. Rich people would arrive in expensive cars, drink wine that cost more than Margaret made in a week, and talk about business deals worth millions of dollars. Margaret's job was to make sure everything was perfect, and then disappear. She was arranging fresh flowers in the main living room when she heard the elevator doors open. Zara stepped out, her school backpack slung over one shoulder and a tired smile on her face. The teenager was tall for her age, with her mother's kind eyes and a quiet confidence that Margaret admired. "Hey, Mama," Zara said softly, setting her backpack down in the corner of the room. "Sorry I'm late. The subway was delayed again." Margaret smiled and walked over to give her daughter a quick hug. "No problem, baby. I just need another hour to get everything ready. You can do your homework right there, okay?" This was their routine when Margaret worked late. Zara would come to the penthouse after school and quietly do her homework, in whatever room Margaret was working in. Mr. Sterling had never complained, and Zara knew to stay out of the way and keep quiet. As Zara settled into a corner chair with her math book, Margaret continued her preparations. She checked the dining room table settings, made sure the expensive wine was properly chilled, and arranged the imported cheese and crackers on silver platters. Everything had to be perfect. Around 7 o'clock, Mr. Sterling emerged from his home office. He was a man in his mid-50s, with silver hair and the kind of casual confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. He wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, but he moved through his enormous apartment like he owned the world. "Margaret," he called out, adjusting his tie. "The guest will be arriving soon. Is everything ready?" "Yes, sir," Margaret replied, giving the dining room one final check. "The caterers delivered the appetizers an hour ago, and I've set up the bar area just like you requested." Mr. Sterling nodded and poured himself a glass of scotch from a crystal decanter. Margaret noticed that he seemed more relaxed than usual, probably because this dinner was supposed to celebrate some big business deal his company had just closed. As he sipped his drink, his eyes wandered around the living room and landed on Zara, who was quietly working on her math homework in the corner. She had her head down, focused on her work, completely unaware that she was being observed. "That's your daughter, right?" Mr. Sterling asked, gesturing toward Zara with his glass. "Yes, sir," Margaret replied, feeling a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. "She'll be out of your way soon. I just need to finish up a few things." Mr. Sterling walked closer to where Zara was sitting, and Margaret watched anxiously. Her daughter looked up politely when she realized she was being addressed. "What grade are you in?" he asked Zara. "10th grade, sir," Zara replied quietly, closing her math book. "Good school?" "Yes, sir." "It's okay." Margaret could see that Zara was uncomfortable with the attention, and she wished she could hurry the conversation along. But Mr. Sterling seemed curious, which was unusual for him. As he continued to look around the room, his gaze fell on the massive grand piano that sat in the center of the living space. It was a beautiful black Steinway that probably cost more than most people's cars. Margaret had always wondered why he owned such an expensive instrument, since she had never once seen or heard him play it. "Do you play piano?" Mr. Sterling asked Zara suddenly. Zara glanced quickly at her mother before answering. "A little bit, sir." Margaret felt her heart skip. She knew that Zara was being modest. Her daughter had been teaching herself to play piano since she was 7 years old, using an old electronic keyboard that Margaret had bought at a pawn shop. Zara would spend hours practicing, watching tutorial videos on her phone and playing along. She had a natural ear for music that amazed Margaret, though they had never been able to afford proper lessons. "Interesting," Mr. Sterling said, taking another sip of his scotch. The alcohol seemed to be making him more talkative than usual. "That piano has been sitting there for 2 years and nobody has ever played it. I bought it because the interior designer said it would look good in the space." The elevator chimed, indicating that the first guests were arriving. Margaret felt relieved, thinking that the conversation would end there. But as well-dressed people began filing into the apartment, Mr. Sterling seemed to get an idea. The guests were the usual crowd: tech executives, investors, and socialites who moved in Mr. Sterling's circle. They gathered around the bar area, talking loudly about stock prices and vacation homes. Margaret recognized a few faces from previous parties, though she doubted any of them remembered her. As the evening progressed and more wine was consumed, the conversation became louder and more animated. Margaret stayed busy refilling glasses and replacing empty appetizer trays, always moving quietly around the edges of the gathering. It was around 9 o'clock when Mr. Sterling, who had clearly had several drinks by this point, suddenly called for everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, raising his glass, "I have a special treat for you tonight. Margaret's daughter here plays piano, and I thought it might be fun to have a little performance." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She looked across the room at Zara, who had gone completely still in her corner chair. The teenager's eyes were wide with shock and fear. "Oh, that's not necessary, sir," Margaret said quickly, moving toward her daughter. Zara was just about to head home anyway, but Mr. Sterling was already walking toward the piano, and his guests were turning to look at Zara with curious expressions. Some of them seemed amused by the idea, while others looked mildly interested in what they clearly expected to be a simple, perhaps clumsy performance from the help's daughter. "Come on," Mr. Sterling said to Zara, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was used to being obeyed. "Just play something simple. It'll be fun." Margaret saw her daughter's hands trembling slightly as she slowly stood up from her chair. This was not how she had imagined their evening would go, and she could see that Zara was terrified. But Margaret also knew they couldn't afford to upset Mr. Sterling. This job was everything to them. "It's okay, baby," Margaret whispered to Zara as she walked past. "Just play something short." As Zara made her way to the piano, the wealthy guests formed a loose circle around the instrument, wine glasses in hand, expecting to be entertained. Zara's legs felt like they might give out as she walked toward the massive black piano. Every step seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room, and she could feel 20 pairs of eyes watching her every movement. Her hands were shaking so badly that she had to clasp them together to try to stop the trembling. The piano bench was made of polished mahogany and probably cost more than her family's monthly rent. As she sat down and adjusted the height, she could hear some of the guests whispering to each other behind her. She caught fragments of their conversations, words like "cute," "this should be interesting," and "how sweet." The tone in their voices made it clear that they weren't expecting much. Margaret stood frozen near the kitchen doorway, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the room might hear it. She wanted to rush over and tell these people that her daughter didn't have to perform for their entertainment. But she also knew that speaking up could cost her the job that kept their small family afloat. Mr. Sterling walked over to stand beside the piano, his scotch glass still in his hand. "Take your time," he said to Zara, though his voice carried the impatience of someone who was used to getting what he wanted quickly. Zara placed her fingers on the keys and felt the familiar smoothness of the ivory. This piano was so different from the small electronic keyboard she practiced on at home. The keys had weight to them, and even without pressing them, she could sense the power of the instrument beneath her hands. She closed her eyes for just a moment, trying to block out the watching crowd and the pressure she felt pressing down on her shoulders. In her mind, she went back to her bedroom in Queens, where she would sit for hours learning songs by ear, playing along with videos on her phone, creating her own melodies when she couldn't find the music she wanted to hear. When she opened her eyes, something had changed. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something stronger. the pure love of music that had carried her through years of teaching herself to play. Her fingers found their first position, and she began to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The opening notes were soft and delicate, like drops of water falling into a still pond. But as the melody developed, it became clear that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't the simple children's song that everyone had expected to hear. The first person to stop talking was a woman, near the bar, who had been in the middle of describing her recent trip to Paris. Her sentence died in her throat as she realized what she was hearing. One by one, the other conversations faded away until the only sound in the room was the music, flowing from Zara's fingertips. The piece she was playing was incredibly complex, the kind of music that professional pianists spend months perfecting. But Zara wasn't just playing the notes correctly. She was making the piano sing with an emotion that seemed impossible for someone her age to possess. Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes as she watched her daughter transform before the entire room. Gone was the shy, frightened teenager who had been pushed into this situation. In her place sat a confident young musician who commanded the instrument like she had been born to play it. The melody soared and dipped, telling a story without words. There were moments of incredible technical difficulty, where Zara's fingers moved so quickly they seemed to blur. And then there were passages of such gentle beauty that several guests found themselves holding their breath. Mr. Sterling's confident smile had completely disappeared. He stood motionless beside the piano, his drink forgotten in his hand, staring at Zara like he was seeing her for the first time. This was not what he had planned when he asked for a fun performance. This was something far beyond his understanding. A woman with silver hair and expensive jewelry moved closer to the piano, her eyes wide with amazement. This was Elena Vasquez, though Margaret didn't know her name yet. Elena was a professor at one of the most prestigious music schools in the country, and she recognized immediately that she was witnessing something rare and precious. As the piece continued, other guests began pulling out their phones, not to text or check social media, but to record what they were hearing. Some of them had attended professional concerts that weren't half as moving as what was happening in this living room. The music built to its dramatic climax, and Zara's entire body moved with the rhythm and emotion of the piece. Her eyes were closed again, and she seemed completely lost in the music. For these few minutes, nothing else existed. Not the watching crowd, not the expensive apartment, not the pressure of performing for people who had expected so little from her. When she played the final, gentle notes, the silence that followed was deafening. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if the entire room was afraid to break the spell that had been cast by a 15-year-old girl who had learned to play piano from YouTube videos. The first person to start clapping was Elena, and her applause was not the polite, patronizing clapping that the guests had planned to offer. It was genuine, enthusiastic applause from someone who understood exactly what she had just witnessed. The rest of the room joined in, but their clapping was different now too. Surprised, almost confused, as if they couldn't quite believe what they had just heard. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Elena asked, stepping forward before the applause had even finished. Zara looked up, still slightly dazed from the intensity of the performance. "I taught myself mostly. I watch videos online and practice on my keyboard at home." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. These people had paid thousands of dollars for their children to take piano lessons with expensive teachers, and none of them could play half as well as this teenager who had learned everything on her own. "YouTube?" asked a man in a designer suit, his voice filled with disbelief. "You learned Chopin from YouTube?" Zara nodded, suddenly aware again of how many people were staring at her. The confidence she had felt while playing was starting to fade, replaced by the familiar shyness. "That's not possible," whispered another guest. "That piece takes years of formal training to master." But Elena was nodding knowingly. In her 30 years of teaching, she had seen a few students with this kind of natural gift, though never to this extent. She looked across the room at Margaret, who was still standing near the kitchen, tears streaming down her face. "Can you play something else?" Elena asked gently. Before Zara could answer, other guests were making requests. Someone called out for Mozart, another asked for jazz, and a third person wanted to hear one of Zara's own compositions. Mr. Sterling finally found his voice. "You write your own music too?" he asked, his earlier casual attitude completely gone. "Sometimes," Zara replied quietly, When I can't find the right song to practice, I just make up something new. The room buzzed with excitement. Phone cameras were recording, and Margaret could see that several people were already posting videos on social media. She felt a mixture of pride and worry. Pride in her daughter's incredible talent, but worry about what this sudden attention might mean for their quiet life. Elena moved closer to Margaret. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice urgent with excitement. "Your daughter has a gift that appears maybe once in a generation. She needs proper training, and she needs it now." Meanwhile, Zara had begun playing another piece, this one her own composition. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with the experiences of a young person who had seen both struggle and hope. As the music filled the room once again, Margaret realized that their lives were about to change forever. The party was supposed to end at 11, but it was nearly midnight and nobody seemed ready to leave. Groups of guests had formed around the piano, all talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Some were still recording videos on their phones, while others were calling friends and family members to tell them about the incredible performance they had just seen. Margaret stood in the corner, watching everything unfold with a mixture of amazement and growing concern. She had cleaned up after dozens of Mr. Sterling's parties, and she had never seen his guests this animated about anything. Usually they would eat their expensive food, drink their wine, talk about business for a few hours, and then disappear into their waiting cars. Tonight was completely different. Zara was still sitting at the piano, looking overwhelmed by all the attention. People kept asking her questions: where she had learned to play, how long she had been practicing, whether she knew other classical pieces. She answered politely, but Margaret could see that her daughter was getting tired and a little scared by all the fuss. Elena, the silver-haired woman who had been so impressed by Zara's playing, was having an intense conversation with her husband near the bar. Margaret couldn't hear what they were saying, but Elena kept gesturing toward Zara and speaking in urgent, excited whispers. Finally, Elena walked over to where Margaret was standing. Up close, Margaret could see that this woman was different from the other guests. While everyone else was dressed in designer clothes and expensive jewelry, Elena wore a simple black dress and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. "I'm Elena Vasquez," she said, extending her hand to Margaret. "I teach at the Juilliard School." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. Even someone like her, who didn't know much about classical music, had heard of Juilliard. It was one of the most famous music schools in the world, the place where the most talented musicians went to study. "I'm Margaret," she replied, shaking Elena's hand nervously. "Is everything okay? Is Zara in some kind of trouble?" Elena smiled warmly. "Trouble? Oh no, quite the opposite. Your daughter is extraordinarily gifted. In 30 years of teaching, I've rarely encountered natural talent at this level." Margaret looked across the room at Zara, who was now playing a gentle jazz melody that she had made up on the spot. Several guests were swaying to the music, completely enchanted. "I don't understand," Margaret said quietly. "She just plays for fun. She learned everything from videos on the internet." "That's exactly what makes this so remarkable," Elena explained. "Most students who can play at her level have been taking expensive lessons since they were very young. They've had professional teachers, years of formal training, access to quality instruments. Your daughter has achieved this level of skill entirely on her own, which suggests an almost supernatural musical intelligence." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes again. She had always known that Zara was special, but she had never imagined that her daughter's hobby could be something so significant. "What does this mean?" Margaret asked, afraid to hope for too much. Elena glanced around the room to make sure nobody was listening, then leaned closer to Margaret. "I want to offer Zara a full scholarship to our preparatory program. It's designed for exceptionally talented young musicians who are preparing to audition for conservatory programs. The scholarship would cover everything: tuition, private lessons, even instrument rental if needed." Margaret's legs suddenly felt weak. A scholarship to Juilliard's preparatory program was the kind of opportunity that could change Zara's entire life. But it also seemed too good to be true. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "We don't have money for applications or auditions or any of that stuff." "There won't be any fees," Elena assured her. "After what I heard tonight, I can guarantee her acceptance into the program. This kind of raw talent combined with her obvious dedication and work ethic, it's exactly what we're looking for." Across the room, Mr. Sterling was having his own moment of realization. He had spent the last hour watching his guests, successful, sophisticated people, completely mesmerized by a teenager he had barely noticed before tonight. The videos that people were posting online were already getting thousands of views and comments. Someone had even started a hashtag about the hidden genius piano girl. But as the excitement continued to build around him, Mr. Sterling was starting to feel uncomfortable. He kept thinking about the casual way he had asked Zara to play for fun and the tone in his voice when he had made the request. He had been expecting a simple, maybe slightly embarrassing performance that would provide a few minutes of light entertainment for his guests. Instead, he had accidentally discovered one of the most talented young musicians anyone in the room had ever encountered. One of his business partners, a man who owned several entertainment companies, pulled him aside. "Jonathan, you need to get this girl a recording contract," he said excitedly. "The videos are already going viral. She could be the next big thing." Mr. Sterling nodded absently, but something about the conversation made him feel even more uncomfortable. He looked across the room at Margaret and Zara, and for the first time, he really saw them as people rather than just his housekeeper and her daughter. Elena was now talking to Zara directly, asking her about her musical interests and her dreams for the future. Zara's answers were thoughtful and mature, but Elena could also hear the uncertainty in her voice. "I've never really thought about music as a career," Zara admitted. "I just love to play. It makes me feel, I don't know, like I can express things that I can't say with words." "That's exactly what music is supposed to do," Elena said gently. "And you have a rare gift for helping other people feel those emotions too. That's not something that can be taught. It's something you're born with." As the evening finally began to wind down, guests started saying their goodbyes. But instead of the usual quick handshakes and promises to do lunch soon, everyone wanted to talk to Margaret and Zara. Business cards were exchanged, phone numbers were shared, and several people mentioned opportunities that might be available for a young musician with Zara's talents. Margaret felt overwhelmed by all the attention. This morning she had been invisible in this apartment, just another worker doing her job quietly and efficiently. Tonight she was the center of attention, with wealthy and powerful people treating her like she mattered. But she also felt a growing sense of unease. These people were excited about Zara's talent, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that some of them saw her daughter as an opportunity rather than as a person. The way Mr. Sterling had treated the whole situation bothered her more and more as she thought about it. When the last guest finally left, the apartment felt strangely quiet. Mr. Sterling stood in his living room, looking at the piano that had been the center of so much excitement. Zara was packing up her school books and Margaret was starting to clean up the glasses and plates left behind by the party. "Margaret," Mr. Sterling called out, his voice more serious than usual. "Could we talk for a moment?" Margaret felt her stomach tighten. She had been dreading this conversation, unsure of how her employer felt about everything that had happened. The party had certainly not gone according to his plan, and she worried that he might blame her somehow for the disruption. Elena had left her business card with both Margaret and Zara, along with detailed information about the scholarship program. As Margaret walked toward Mr. Sterling, she clutched the card in her hand, hoping that whatever he was about to say wouldn't somehow take away this incredible opportunity that had fallen into their lives. Margaret walked across the marble floor, her footsteps echoing in the now quiet apartment. Zara had gathered her school books and was waiting by the elevator, tired but still glowing from all the attention she had received. The teenager kept looking at Elena's business card, reading the words Juilliard School over and over as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. Mr. Sterling was standing by the large windows that overlooked the city, his hands clasped behind his back. He had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, and for the first time since Margaret had known him, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing toward one of the expensive leather chairs near the window. Margaret remained standing. After 3 years of working for this man, she had never been invited to sit in his furniture. Tonight felt different, but she wasn't sure if the difference was good or bad. "I want to apologize," Mr. Sterling said, turning to face her directly. "What I did tonight was wrong." Margaret felt her heart racing. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge anything, let alone apologize. "I put your daughter in an uncomfortable position." he continued. I asked her to perform for my guests without really thinking about how that might feel for her. I was treating her like entertainment. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret had been thinking the same thing all evening, but hearing him say it out loud made her realize just how angry she had become. She's not a performing monkey, Margaret said quietly, her voice steady but firm. She's a 15-year-old girl who was just trying to do her homework while I finished work. Mr. Sterling nodded, looking genuinely ashamed. You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry. But Margaret, what happened tonight? Your daughter is incredibly talented. Those people in there, they weren't just being polite. They were genuinely amazed by what they heard. I know she's talented, Margaret replied, her voice getting stronger. I've known that for years. But that doesn't mean she should have to prove herself to a room full of strangers who were expecting to laugh at her. The truth of what had almost happened was becoming clearer to both of them. Mr. Sterling had made his request expecting a simple, probably amateur performance that would provide a few minutes of mild entertainment. His guests had gathered around the piano with wine glasses in their hands, ready to smile politely at a child's attempt at music. The way you asked her to play, Margaret continued, the way you said it would be fun. What kind of fun were you expecting, Mr. Sterling? He winced at the question because they both knew the answer. He had been expecting the kind of fun that comes from watching someone try to do something they're not particularly good at. The kind of fun that makes the audience feel superior and sophisticated. I have no excuse for that, he admitted. I made assumptions that were unfair and frankly, pretty terrible. I'm sorry. Margaret looked across the room at Zara, who was pretending not to listen to their conversation, but was obviously hearing every word. Her daughter deserved so much better than this. Those videos that your guest took, Margaret said. They're already online, aren't they? Mr. Sterling nodded reluctantly. Some of them have thousands of views already. People are calling her a prodigy, a hidden genius. There's a lot of positive attention. Attention that we never asked for, Margaret pointed out. Attention that happened because you put my daughter on the spot in front of a room full of strangers. You're right, he said again. And I want to make this right. I can help Zara with her musical education. I can pay for the best teachers, the best schools, whatever she needs. Margaret felt a flash of anger that surprised her with its intensity. You think you can fix this with money? I just want to help, Mr. Sterling said, clearly frustrated. Your daughter has an incredible gift. She deserves every opportunity to develop it. She deserves opportunities that she earns through her own talent and hard work, Margaret replied firmly, not opportunities that come because some rich man feels guilty about how he treated her. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Mr. Sterling's phone buzzing repeatedly. He glanced at it and frowned. What is it? Margaret asked, seeing his expression. The videos are spreading faster than I expected, he said, scrolling through notifications. Major news websites are picking up the story. Someone created a social media page called Piano Girl that already has 50,000 followers. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. This was exactly what she had been afraid of. She walked over to Zara, who was now looking worried. Mama, what does this mean? Zara asked quietly. I don't know, baby, Margaret answered honestly, but we're going to figure it out together. Mr. Sterling was still looking at his phone, his frown getting deeper. There are reporters calling my office already. They want to know about the maid's daughter and her story. The maid's daughter, Margaret repeated, her voice cold. Is that how you see us? He looked up quickly. No, that's not. That's just how they're describing it in the headlines. But Margaret could see the truth in his eyes. Despite his apology, despite his offers to help, he still saw her primarily as his employee and Zara as the employee's child. The talent that had amazed his guest tonight hadn't changed his fundamental view of who they were in his world. I think we should go, Margaret said, walking toward the elevator where Zara was waiting. Wait, Mr. Sterling called out. What about tomorrow? You're scheduled to work tomorrow. Margaret stopped and turned back to face him. She had been thinking about this question all evening, and now she knew her answer. I won't be coming in tomorrow, she said calmly, or any day after that. You're quitting? He looked genuinely shocked. Yes, I am. But why? I apologized. I offered to help with Zara's education. I'm trying to make this right. Margaret looked around the enormous apartment one last time, at the expensive furniture she had polished, the marble floors she had cleaned, the massive piano that had changed everything. Then she looked back at Mr. Sterling, who still seemed to think that money and good intentions could fix what had happened. Because I don't want my daughter to grow up thinking that her talents exist for other people's entertainment, Margaret said quietly. Because I don't want her to believe that she needs permission from wealthy people to pursue her dreams. And because I don't want to work for someone who sees us as curiosities instead of people. She pressed the elevator button and put her arm around Zara's shoulders. The scholarship to Juilliard, Mr. Sterling said desperately as the elevator doors began to open. You'll take that, won't you? Elena was serious about that offer. Margaret looked at Elena's business card still clutched in Zara's hand. That's different, she said. Elena recognized Zara's talent and wants to help her develop it because she believes in her abilities. That's not the same as wanting to fix a guilty conscience. The elevator doors closed and they descended toward the lobby in silence. As they walked out of the building and onto the busy New York street, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The freedom that comes from standing up for yourself and your family, even when it's scary and uncertain. Are you okay, Mama? Zara asked as they waited for the bus that would take them back to Queens. I'm better than okay, Margaret replied, squeezing her daughter's hand. We're going to be just fine. But as they rode the bus home, both of them wondered what the morning would bring, and whether Margaret's decision to quit had been brave or simply foolish. 2 years had passed since that life-changing evening in Mr. Sterling's penthouse, and the world looked completely different for Margaret and Zara. The small apartment in Queens was filled with the sound of piano music almost every day now, but it was no longer coming from an old electronic keyboard. A beautiful upright piano sat in their living room, not as grand as Mr. Sterling's Steinway, but perfect for their needs. Zara was now 17 and had grown into a confident young woman who carried herself with quiet grace. She was in her final year at Juilliard's preparatory program, where she had not only excelled but had become something of a legend among her classmates. Her teachers often said they had never seen anyone progress so quickly from raw talent to refined artistry. The videos from that night at the penthouse had indeed gone viral, but in ways that no one could have predicted. Instead of just being entertainment, they had sparked conversations about hidden talent, economic inequality, and the importance of arts education. Zara had become a symbol of what was possible when natural gifts were given proper support and respect. But the real changes had happened in quieter ways, in the daily choices that Margaret and Zara had made together. Margaret no longer worked as a housekeeper. Elena had introduced her to a nonprofit organization that provided music education to underserved communities, and Margaret had discovered a passion for administration and program development. Her job as community outreach coordinator allowed her to work normal hours and gave her the flexibility to support Zara's increasingly demanding performance schedule. On this particular Saturday morning, Margaret was getting ready for one of the most important days in Zara's young career. Tonight, her daughter would be performing her own composition at Carnegie Hall as part of a showcase for promising young composers. The piece was called Hidden Harmonies, and it told the story of dreams that grow in unexpected places. Are you nervous? Margaret asked as she helped Zara with the zipper on her black concert dress. A little, Zara admitted, looking at herself in the mirror. But it's a different kind of nervous than I used to feel. Now I'm nervous because I want to play well, not because I'm afraid people won't take me seriously. That confidence had been hard-won. In the months after leaving Mr. Sterling's employment, there had been plenty of challenges. Margaret had struggled to find work that paid enough to support them while giving her time to help Zara navigate her new opportunities. There had been reporters who wanted to sensationalize their story, and people who seemed more interested in the drama than in Zara's actual musical development. But there had also been wonderful surprises. Elena had become not just a teacher but a mentor and friend to their entire family. Other musicians had reached out to offer support and guidance. Most importantly, Zara had found her community at Juilliard, young people who understood her passion for music and who saw her talent as something to celebrate rather than something unusual or surprising. The scholarship had covered everything Elena had promised and more. Zara had access to practice rooms with professional quality pianos, private lessons with world-class teachers, and opportunities to perform with orchestras and chamber groups. She had even spent a summer at a music festival in Europe, an experience that had broadened her understanding of classical music traditions from around the world. As they prepared to leave for Carnegie Hall, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled. "Who's that?" Zara asked, noticing her mother's expression. "Elena," Margaret replied. "She's already at the hall, making sure everything is set up perfectly for tonight." Elena had become like family to them over the past 2 years. She had been there for Zara's first formal recital, had celebrated every small victory, and had provided guidance through the occasional setbacks that came with intensive musical training. She had also been a fierce advocate for Zara when other people tried to turn her story into something exploitative or sensational. The ride to Carnegie Hall was quiet, both women lost in their own thoughts. Margaret found herself thinking about all the moments that had led to this evening. The hours Zara had spent practicing on that old keyboard. The leap of faith they had taken when Margaret quit her job. The slow building of a new life centered around music and mutual respect, rather than economic desperation. When they arrived at the famous concert hall, Margaret felt the same sense of awe she always experienced in this building. This was where the greatest musicians in the world came to perform, and tonight her daughter would be among them. Backstage, they found Elena waiting with a small group of Zara's fellow students and teachers. The atmosphere was excited but supportive. These people had all worked together to help Zara reach this moment, and they were as invested in her success as she was. "How are you feeling?" Elena asked, giving Zara a warm hug. "Ready," Zara replied, and Margaret could hear the truth in her daughter's voice. As showtime approached, Margaret took her seat in the audience. She looked around at the elegant theater, with its red velvet seats and crystal chandeliers, and marveled at how far they had come from that uncomfortable evening in a Manhattan penthouse. The lights dimmed, and Zara walked onto the stage. She wore the same quiet confidence that Margaret had seen develop over the past 2 years, but there was something else now, a sense of belonging. This wasn't a scared teenager being asked to perform for other people's entertainment. This was a serious young artist sharing her work with an audience that had come specifically to hear what she had to say. Zara sat at the piano and took a moment to center herself. Then she began to play hidden harmonies. The music was complex and beautiful, weaving together classical techniques with jazz influences and original melodies that seemed to come from some deep place in Zara's heart. The piece told a story about talent that grows in small apartments and practice rooms, about dreams that survive despite economic hardship, about the power of music to transform both the performer and the listener. As Margaret listened, she found herself crying, not from sadness but from overwhelming pride and joy. This was her daughter, sharing her gifts with the world on her own terms, in a space where she was respected and valued for exactly who she was. The performance was flawless, but more than that, it was deeply moving. When Zara played the final notes, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. People rose to their feet, and Margaret could see that many others in the audience were wiping away tears as well. After the concert, there was a reception where audience members could meet the performers. Margaret watched as people approached Zara, not as a curiosity or a feel-good story, but as a serious artist whose work had touched them. The conversations were about the music itself, about technique and emotion and the future of classical composition. Elena appeared at Margaret's side, beaming with pride. "She's something special, isn't she?" "She always was," Margaret replied. "She just needed the right people to recognize it." As the evening wound down, Margaret reflected on all the changes in their lives. They had a comfortable apartment now, financial security, and most importantly, a sense of dignity and purpose that had been missing during those years of struggling to make ends meet. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Zara saw herself. She was no longer the shy girl hiding in the corner while her mother worked. She was a confident young woman who knew her worth, who understood that her talents were valuable, not because they entertained others, but because they expressed something true and beautiful about the human experience. On the ride home, Zara was quiet, still processing the emotions of the evening. "Thank you, Mama," she said finally. "For what?" "For believing in me, for standing up for us, for showing me that I didn't have to accept being treated like I was less than anyone else." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. "You did all the hard work, baby. I just made sure you had the chance to do it." As they pulled up to their building in Queens, both women knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more performances, more opportunities, more challenges to navigate, but they would face them together, with the knowledge that they had already overcome the biggest challenge of all, learning to value themselves and demand that others do the same.